Welcome back to the Nate Wenke Podcast, and my guest today is Christopher Balkaran, and thanks for coming on, Chris.
No problem, Nate. I'm so excited to be here.
Cool. So, we connected a couple days ago, and I'm like, hey, you got a podcast? I got a podcast.
Yeah.
Be fun to have a chat and kind of see that world. It's a unique world that a lot of people don't necessarily know unless you're in it. Mm-hmm. So I guess that would be kind of the first topic I want to quick talk about here. What was the initial impetus for starting a podcast? What was your initial reason for doing so?
Yeah, Nate. So I'll give you a very quick story. I was 27 years old at the time, 28, 29, maybe late 20s, working in government, and I just felt like everything was just, the weight of the world was on my shoulders at the time. I felt I knew so much at my job. I was so knowledgeable. I wasn't getting promoted. My manager was really painful. I worked in this bureaucracy. Nobody was listening to me. I had all this insight, and I just felt angry, and I couldn't explain why I felt this way. Other aspects of my life were kind of discombobulated. I would wake up every morning at 4:30 a.m. and go for my morning bike rides and work out in the gym, but I'd also eat terribly. I didn't have good control over my diet. So I would tell people that I'm working out, and I did, and I'd show them my results, like my 47-minute bike ride this morning at 5:30 a.m. along the lake shore here in Toronto. But then I'd have McDonald's, and then I wouldn't work out for a couple of days, and then I'd do it again. Like, it was just a very discombobulated way of living. Mm-hmm. And I found myself every night just angry, like 5:30 p.m. coming home, just like angry, like why I'm working so hard and why is this? And then it just hit me one day when I think it was what someone really close to me said, you don't smile as much as you used to. And I said, Jesus, this is coming off in every aspect of my life now. And so I just said to myself, Christopher, what's going on? What's happening? And I would come home every day and I would just write down, if you lived in an ideal world, if there was something that you could do, what would that be? And I realized one thing that really upset me was the way in which the news was covering topics.
Yeah.
It was doing such a disservice to these topics. And I thought, why? Why are we living in this time where fewer voices are speaking with this greater authority? I mean, maybe that was also weighing on my mind. And I said, well, what would you do? I would create a podcast where the goal isn't about pitting liberals against conservatives, Republicans against Democrats. It's about taking these issues, bringing on people, and fundamentally exploring it with no political agenda. Just let's go. Let's see where this conversation takes us, kind of thing. And it was one of the best decisions I think I ever made.
Really cool to hear, man. Really cool. It's interesting because I see a lot of parallels at the moment between us in terms of why you started it and why I started my own, and that things bugged me too. I would get quite just annoyed at the state of things, and one of the things I thought was, okay, so I can either spend my time being irritated about it, have my rants with my friends, or perhaps I can open up my mind and have conversations with a lot of different people and kind of spend some time really thinking through these issues and maybe even try to change other people's perspectives too in a positive way,
of course,
and with humility as my guide. So I I see a lot of that mentality in what you just said and what you do, and I really respect that. So that's pretty cool. What would you say has been like? Let's do the biggest challenge of the podcast, and then the biggest triumph. Let's go there.
Definitely, the biggest challenge has been, without a doubt, letting people know my vision in a clear and concise way where they feel comfortable being themselves on the podcast. I can't tell you how many times I've wanted to explore topics and I've just had no, I don't know you, and that's fine. I'm used to getting rejected. But it's because I'm not clearly defining what the podcast is about. It's not about painting anybody in a corner. I think there's been a lot of organizations that have gone on, whether it's podcasts or on media, and they just get attacked. And they're just like, you know what? I'm not doing this. It's not worth my time.
Sure.
And they don't know me. So my goal now is to build up my sweat equity and show it to people that I'm not here to paint you in a corner. Like, check out my website, check out my podcast, look at the people I've had on. Building that trust has definitely been the biggest challenge, because there's so many interesting organizations I want to have on, but the trust just isn't there because of the negative experiences they've had with media. The biggest triumph, Nate, honestly, has been podcasting has forced me to think clearly and communicate clearly. Nothing else in my life could have pushed me the way podcasting has to do that. You're supposed to, formulate your thoughts in a clear way, communicate in a clear way. That right there is a triumph. And when I see and hear people who have clear communication, I'm like, wow, that is amazing, because it's so rare. So that has been the biggest triumph, I would say, from the podcast: clear communication and clear thinking.
Yeah, man, no, that's cool to hear. The negative, let's touch on that for a second.
Yeah.
It's you pointed out this problem earlier, just the media today, and it has been for quite some time. And I think, let's talk about this for a second. We seem to be trapped in this old model of media, of 5-minute sound bites of a couple main channels that you get your news from. And I see the mainstream media, and I see them, in my opinion, they're slowly dying. They're slowly dying. And in order to rescue themselves from this inevitable decay of this old format, they continually push more clickbaity, more fear-inducing, negative content. Because as humans, there's a certain amount of psychology behind this, that we're hardwired to be more predisposed to react with greater intensity to negative emotion. So it seems to me like they are, as they are in their declining state, they're moving into this area of negative content. And I think that's part of the reason a lot of people just don't like media these days. But what I see you doing, what I see Joe Rogan doing, what I see podcasters doing, is they're opening up that, and they're kind of reversing that old rigid way of doing interviews, of media. And we're saying, we're going to sit down for an hour or 2 or 3. It's going to be unscripted. And we're going to say, I want you to give me your honest opinion. I'm going to give my honest opinion. And we're both going to try and come from a place of humility and figure this out. And that perspective, I think, is so beautiful. And you pointed that out, is what that's led you to, from the positive light, what that's done is that's allowed you to really focus on what you say in a coherent manner, and then also learn to recognize, okay, how can I be the most humble version of myself to listen to these other people, make them feel like, look, this is an environment where I want them to be honest. And that's a huge challenge. And yet the result of that challenge is that you've embraced it and pushed towards trying to create this atmosphere. And I want to quick touch on, and you can respond to all that too. Sorry, that was a long one. But
no, I love that.
I can't remember the exact post, but when I was just kind of looking at some of your content, I think you had one on a specific law where basically you had forgotten to read something or mischaracterized something, and then you ended up editing it after the fact and said, I got this wrong. And I thought, man, that's really cool to see, because you don't see that very often. You don't see people doing that. So I don't know if you want to comment on that and just kind of the overall framework.
Of course. That's great, Nate. A couple things there. One, definitely when it comes to that, you mentioned the humility piece, and I think that's so critical. So I made a post, in Ireland, there's increasing hate laws around the world now. In many European countries, I believe it is illegal, and people can call me out in the comments for this, but I believe it is illegal in more countries to deny the Holocaust. Like, you will be charged now for that. And that to me is interesting. Again, will never, never deny the Holocaust. But the fact that someone could be charged for an opinion is interesting to me. In Ireland, there are hate laws that recently passed that includes gender-based discrimination and gender, if you misgender someone. But I misinterpreted that law to say that people couldn't openly talk about those issues in a free-flowing podcast, as an example. But actually, there's a section within the law that says if you're undertaking a discussion for educational and informative purposes, this law does not apply to you. And of course, in my haste, I missed that section, and I was called out in the comments for it. And so I edited that post. I put in the description, I said, I was wrong 100. I made a story. I said, I am totally wrong. Thank you to these people. And I added them, and I said, thank you so much for letting me know. That's a major miscalculation on my part, and I should be held to account for that. I always think, why not own up to it? What's in it for me to not own up to that? That shows being disingenuous. And that's not the type of content I want to put out. That's not the kind of following I want to have. So let me lean into the uncomfortable discussion and let me be 100% honest.
Sure.
Because I think when you're not, and you just think, let me just fire off another social media content reel and no one's going to think about it. It's like something's happening to your brand. More importantly, something's happening to you, where you're now looking at this as flooding the airways with just content and not thinking about your character. And to me, character has to precede all of that.
No, that's huge. That's huge, man. Yeah, I want to point that out. It's just mad respect for that, for sure. One where this issue gets a little bit more complicated is when you feel like, so let's say that you do make a genuine mistake and you have people call you out for that and you correct yourself. I'm all for that. Let's say that you post, a piece of content that, well, if it's a short, by definition, it's probably going to lack some context. It's probably going to lack the nuance of the broader conversation. And one of the tricky things that I encounter is that there are a lot of people that will jump on the fact that you left out content or context or the fact that you left out nuance and will just hammer into that or will present a straw man argument.
Sure.
And then, how do you respond? Again, this dichotomy, it's one thing when someone has a constructive criticism. They're like, hey, man, I think you missed this. Relook at this. And I'm like, all for that. One thing that I struggle to know how to react to is, what do you do when you have people that are obviously misinterpreting what you're saying? And you may even suspect it's a intentional move. How do you respond to that, do you think?
Yeah, you're right. In this kind of short attention span theater, there's no room anymore for context when it comes to reels and shorts. I think the way I navigate that, Nate, is, and it's a very good question, is I openly state understanding the broader picture, right? So let's say I'm doing a reel on poverty and crime and the linkage. I'll say, this is a big issue, but this is specifically what the governor of New York said about the linkage between poverty and crime. And then I'll dive into specifically what that person said. That's one way of kind of contextualizing it. Yes, things always get taken out of context in the comment section. But I find that, as you know pretty well, Nate, but I find that those voices are actually not as much as those that are like, I get what you're saying. I can follow your line of thinking. You mentioned earlier about how media is slowly dying. I think a correlation, a reason why it is because we are the most educated generation than ever before. There's more people with bachelor's and master's degrees. So there's that critical thinking in more of the population than ever before. And I feel like people understand when they're being lied to or being deceived. And I feel like the general public is much more smarter than the media may give them credit for. And the same is true on social media. When we think of shorts and reels, people generally know your sentiment. There will be people in the comments who will be like, well, what about this? And what did you mean by this? And then, of course, there's those that go further and call you all types of names.
Oh, yeah.
But the critics sometimes are, that's bound to happen. But those voices, I try my best to say, remember, they're few and far between. Think of the hundreds of people who said, I get what you're saying. That's, this is a really good conversation to be having. So I just chalk it up to the fact that when you post things publicly, you're going to bound to find that. But those voices aren't nearly as common as people might think.
Yep. No, I totally hear you. I have a basic rule with this, just purely based upon probability, which is 90% of people probably will have a fairly neutral, maybe slightly positive, maybe slightly negative reaction to your video. They're not the ones commenting. Then you're going to have 5% of people that are either in the extreme category of they had a horrible day and they want to let it out.
Yes.
And your thing happened to come across their page.
Yep.
And they're going to say something about it.
Correct.
And then maybe you have 1 or 2% of people that just loved it and they're going to let you know. But back to this kind of negative selective mechanism, generally speaking, that negative reaction is going to get a bigger presence in the comment section because especially on platforms that don't allow a dislike button, there's almost no other recourse other than that. So I keep that in mind because I think, wow, okay, this has 1,000 views and it has one negative comment. And what does that really mean? But it's crazy how the psychology there, even it's just one, it can ruin your day if you let it. So I think you had some good words of wisdom there on how to deal with that. But what do you think of that rule? You kind of like that?
I love that. Yeah. I think that it's how our minds. It's one of the pitfalls in the human mind sometimes. It's like these algorithms know exactly, these social media companies know what they're doing. It's why, when you message me, that icon is red. It's not blue, it's not green, it's not yellow, it's red. Yep. Why? Because they know that as soon as I see that red, I jump to my inbox, I find out what Nate's sending me, right? Like that's the first thing you do when you open Instagram. So they know how our minds work, and the same is true with the negative comments. And so sometimes the negative comments are so bad that I'll say to them, I'll say, wow, you really sat down and thought through that insult. You spent time thinking about this, and you probably watched that reel like 4 or 5 times to come up with it while you were writing your comment. Like, thank you.
Yep.
Yeah.
No, I hear you. That's so funny. All right, so it's within this same sphere, but I want to kind of switch topics a little bit. Sure. So we talked about the dying media, at least the mainstream media, and this movement towards free-flowing conversations, which I think overall is a positive movement. Part of this, I think, is that we've seen, specifically in the mainstream media, certain perspectives are shunned or not, in some cases, just not even allowed to be talked about at all. Yeah. And from a broader perspective, this idea of free speech, this is one of these, I guess it's somewhat of a buzz term that gets thrown around, like free speech. What does that really mean? And I want to give you a chance to comment on that. But from what I've observed and from all available metrics, free speech is, if not the fundamental value, one of the fundamental values that undergirds Western civilization as such, and then more specifically the Constitution of the United States. We have, from what I can tell, the most robust protection for free speech in the world. Yeah. And this is something that, from a historical perspective, is completely unheard of, and it is something that I think we take for granted. So what do you think? It's a big topic, so I'll kind of, wherever you want to go with this, but what do you think about the current, what I would say is a decline in free speech? What do you think about this issue today?
Yeah, Nate, that's a great question. It's definitely a big topic, as you mentioned. To me, it's got the roots go back to ancient Greek philosophy, right? So you had these two real theories at the time that Plato and Socrates were very concerned with. One was the freedom for people to speak, period. Everyone has a right to speak, period. And then on the other hand, there were people who spoke very boldly, those whose voices had additional weight. But in between that, you had this phase of understanding that was so critical. And so while Plato and Socrates, Plato more so, he wasn't too big a fan of everyone having a voice and those with very strong voices speaking boldly. For Plato, as I understand it, he was more concerned about that interplay between understanding leading to rational thought. Logos is a big theory in Greek philosophy that says when you speak and your voice commands public policy direction, it's because you've gone through that understanding phase, and now you're in a position to speak, quote unquote, logos, like this, authority. You're now the wise elder, and you can speak based on your experiences or your understanding. I feel like we've kind of manipulated free speech to say, well, everyone has a voice, and now they can speak on public policy decisions. It's like everyone has a voice, but that understanding piece is so critical. It's absolutely critical.
Yeah.
And so how we get to speak from logos or from that rational kind of wise elder is going through that really difficult pain of battling it out. Like, really, like, let's get into this, like, let's really battle this out because we want to get to logos. We want to be that wise elder, but we can't circumvent that really important phase. And I feel like that's what's happening today. It's like too many voices reaching logos before they have gone through the steps necessary to tease that out. And I see this constantly when we see, leaders of state governments talking, like, and you just wonder sometimes, like, did you really think this through? And, but we see this everywhere. And that's my big concern with the public square. It's that more voices jumping the gun, going to the, they've raised money, they became some big person online, and now they're speaking with authority. It's like, just because people like your content or like what you're saying doesn't necessarily mean that you've gone through that phase. Mm-hmm. I think that's one of our big issues today with free speech.
Interesting. Yeah, that distinction that you made was really useful. I've not heard it articulated in that way, so thank you for that. That's a really good point, though, and from a broader perspective, you run into this problem of, like, you want to allow everyone to still have the right to have that voice, or at least have the possibility of reaching that logos and reaching that. But the consequence of that is that there will be a lot of people that don't go through that process of understanding, don't go through the hard work of allowing criticism of their ideas focused on the truth to take place, which is the necessary part of becoming or getting a nuanced perspective of things. They don't ever get to that phase, and then you add in that everyone has a smartphone today, and we're in some sense more connected than ever, and someone that normally wouldn't have a voice does have a voice. And again, we get back to this pros and cons. In some ways, that's great, and that's awesome that they do. But also then, if they haven't thought through what they're saying, and they're simply injecting more noise into an already very noisy environment without clarity, that's not helpful. So that's I think Twitter might be a good example of that phenomenon.
Yeah, of course, Nate. And I think also, so here's another twist to this too. I feel like deep spiritual awakening, self-engineering, and self-health is also really important to this journey. I think that it's always like you hear these stories from the Romans. It's like, the wise elders were the ones that were the inner circle to help the leader, navigate these public policy issues. It's like, well, think about that on a micro level. It's like, if you go through some real serious stuff in your own personal life, you go through relationships, breakups, makeups, family drama, child drama, all that, like, you become this person in your family that's like, wow, you've weathered a lot of storms, and you can help some of the younger ones out with what they're going through, whether it's through advice or even financially, maybe they need a leg up. I feel like that's similar to the strategy in getting into the logos. It's like, go through some harrowing pain, you know? You might come out just that much more introspective. I say this because I've done so much work on myself, and I realize how little I actually know, and how life is just this massive project that we're always solving problems. So even if I do study and have like an 8-part series on abortion, who the heck am I to talk about abortion?
Sure,
I'm just scratching the surface. And so perhaps that's part of reaching the logos. It's go through some real difficulties and come out the other side that much more better for it.
No, that's a very good point. The comment about realizing that you don't know anything, I'm very familiar with. I like to. It's like the first thing that you realize. Say that you want to learn more about economics, right? The first thing that you realize while trying to learn more about economics is that you actually don't know anything about economics, and the fact that your somewhat conceived notion of what you did know was completely wrong. And the more that you go into it, the more you realize just how much there is to know. Yeah. And, that's not always the case, but it's pretty darn close to always the case with things. And I remember I'm actually still in school, and I've been taking a philosophy course, and,
nice.
You jump from Kant to Kierkegaard to Nietzsche, and, you get a snippet of some of their writings, and you just, some days you just sit back and you think, oh man, this is just insanity, the quantity and depth of information. And but I also think that that's, as you've pointed out, a necessary part of the process of recognizing, okay, look, here are all these really, really smart people that have powerful perspectives. How can I integrate their views into my own, and how can I become a better, more nuanced person because of that? And I think that's really important. And you can comment on that, but I do want to quick bring us into another topic, which is within this, which is this political correctness issue. And I know we want to talk about this, so I want to hear what you think about this broadly speaking. But one definition that I have come across, which I think is useful, and I actually think Bill Maher first said this, but it's basically just the elevation of feelings over facts is in one way to categorize political correctness. What do you think about that? And then I don't know if you want to try and tie it into that that reality of not knowing things, if that might be part of it or not.
Yeah, Nate, that's a really good question. These are really good questions. The best comparison I can make to discovering things when it, figuring out where you stand on something by, exploring different opinions and views. I'm fascinated by archaeology. Not so much archaeologists, but the study itself, archaeology.
Sure.
Because I remember vividly going to Mexico and seeing Chichen Itza and seeing some of the pyramids. And the more I looked at these structures, I was always amazed, and I kept having all of these questions in my back of my mind. It's like the tour guide was telling us one thing, but in my mind I'm thinking, okay, it's 100 degrees, it's humid as heck out here, we're in the middle of the jungle, and they somehow built this massive structure out of limestone using what kind of scaffolding? How did they actually build this? And the more I thought about it, the more I realized archaeology is the study of displaying the world for what it is. It's not about answering those questions. It's about, and when archaeologists try to answer those questions, there's they realize there's that stone on the other side that just doesn't make sense because it's so big and it's so massive, and they didn't use, jigsaw tools and cutters, but somehow it's like it laser fits with the other stones and they can't figure it out. It's like, archaeology isn't about explaining the why. It's showcasing this is what it is. And it allows you, the individual, to come to your own conclusions, to say, you know what, maybe they built it, but maybe it was a highly advanced civilization and we just don't have the answers. They must have used some type of tool to cut these stones. It makes no sense. But really archaeology isn't, and I feel like that's the same with political correctness. Sometimes we're worried so much about the why, and like, you know, why are black people not the CEOs of companies? It's because of white supremacy. Well, let's unpack that. Instead of trying to answer the why, let's take it for what it is and let's explore it without preconceived notions. And what we might find in that endeavor, in this specific example that I use, is that maybe, just maybe, some black people are very qualified to become executives and CEOs, but they don't see themselves in positions of authority because it's only been white people, so they're not applying. And so maybe that conversation has to be with black leaders to say, how can we help support black staff that could easily get into these positions? All they need to do is see themselves in those positions. So then you start saying, wow, it's no longer about white supremacy. It's about personal empowerment. And suddenly your mind opens up, like how mine was when I saw these laser cut stones in Chichen Itza, and I thought to myself, it's like, wow, this is the beauty. This is the true beauty of human curiosity and understanding. It's like on the front lines of seeing what you think is true, and then you just turning that stone and realizing, I have no idea what I have uncovered and unearthed here. And I'm so fascinated to study the what is instead of figuring out the why. So to me, that's where we're getting into the political correctness. We're focusing too much on the why. I think that answered your question.
Okay. Perhaps.
Yeah.
Do you want to... So I followed you for the most part. So I like the archaeology example. I get what you're getting at there. With political correctness, how about you go a little bit more into, today? Where do you see that? And then do you think that there is a potentially positive element to it, or do you think that it's always inherently negative? Give me some more
of course,
practical examples. I'm just curious.
Yeah, so I think political correctness today stems from many groups who've never felt like they were part of the dominant conversation. They just felt completely left out. So here in Canada, in Toronto, we do land acknowledgements to Indigenous communities. And our land acknowledgements, this started by the federal government in the recent past, where we acknowledge the land that the government took from Indigenous peoples to start off meetings, to start off events. We did a Truth and Reconciliation Commission report here in Canada, and there were 95 or 96 calls to action that Indigenous groups demanded the government do, or at least, it's calling to action for the government. So this put the national spotlight on a community that felt so underrepresented from the mainstream discussion. And so, again, inherently, that's a good thing to broaden the discussion out to include underrepresented groups. Sure. I think that's a good thing. And there's so many groups that we haven't had, that hasn't had that same light shone on them. People with disabilities, people with hearing impairments, people with autism spectrum disorder. There are many communities still that will emerge in the years ahead that will talk about their own experiences in living in this world and being cut out of the dominant discourse. Where it gets challenging goes back to that freedom of speech discussion, where it's, Nate, you are a bad person, not because of who you are, but because of what you represent. You are deserving of a spotlight, not because of who you are, but because of the people you represent. We're skipping that understanding piece again. We're going right to demanding action and speaking with authority, when in fact it's very, very complicated.
Sure.
That's the challenge that political correctness has before it. It's this inclusion lens, which is, most people would agree, is a good thing, but it's marred with you must act now in accordance with this group, because fewer voices from that group have defined how you are to act in response to it.
Okay.
That's the challenge I see today with political correctness.
Okay. So let me try and reiterate here. So potentially what you're focusing on, or what you're maybe noticing, is that the motivation for political correctness comes from a good place. It comes from this, okay, we want to ensure that these people are included. We want to ensure that we're not avoiding things unnecessarily, let's say. But one of the consequences of that, potentially, is that, and this is where this is where I think it gets particularly negative, is when you then assume someone, you identify someone based upon their immutable group characteristics, not based upon their individual identity. And that, I'd say, is one of my larger problems with political correctness as a whole. And
Yes.
I personally think that stems from a Marxist idea of group identity being paramount over individual identity from a philosophical standpoint. So that's where I have a particular problem with it. Question for you. I want to kind of you made a comment at the beginning, and I want to get your thoughts on this. I may even want to push back a little bit. This idea of land acknowledgments. I find this to be fascinating. So the reason I find this to be fascinating, and I'm not really putting myself in a particular camp. I want to see what you think.
Yeah.
For all of human history, the history, and I think a lot of people don't really realize this, the history of humanity is essentially tribal warfare. Essentially one group, through force, killing other people or enslaving them and taking their land. And I guess part of my question or potential problem with land acknowledgments is I wonder if by singling out Canada or the U.S. or our current governmental structures, let's say, or the people the first settlers, Columbus, these people as uniquely evil for the things that they did, I think that does a disservice to the context of history. And that isn't me saying that we don't get to say that's bad or that's suboptimal. But I think if we miss that context, we're doing a disservice to the issue. What do you think about that in the context of land acknowledgments?
I 100% agree with you. I don't personally believe land acknowledgments serve any real purpose.
Yeah.
Because Canada, I believe, is the only G7 country to do a land acknowledgement. There are many countries around the world who have indigenous populations and do not acknowledge those groups and do not allow them to be part of the dominant discourse. So I 100% agree with that. I think, though, that there is, when we go down that path of inclusion and of inclusive voices, there are many within many communities that say, well, hang on, in Canada in particular, I'll give just a brief history of Canada and Indigenous relations. The English and French settlers signed treaties with First Nations, Métis, and Inuit communities here in Canada. Those were under, you don't know the language, right? And this is like British English common law, legalese. So Toronto, for example, was sold for rum and tobacco. Manhattan was sold for, I can't remember, I think $13 at the time. Yeah. It was, so that I think is where it stems from. It's this idea that we acknowledge that we are, as a Canadian citizen, we recognize that we did some messed up things to take your land away from you. And it runs counter to the King's proclamation in 1763 that this is Aboriginal title to land. And so there is a lot of legalese behind these, but I still don't see the purpose in today's modern age. I think you're right. The understanding of our history is marred with complexity, and a land acknowledgement seeks to simplify that complexity, I think.
Sure. Yeah. No, I totally hear you. Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. So, let's go here real quick. This is something that's fairly recent. I just want to hear what you think. So, the Twitter files within this context of political correctness, free speech, and then of course you can just inject the complexity of COVID, which is a whole issue. You could do 20 podcasts on that. But do you think that there is a unique threat posed by the government pressuring corporations into doing their dirty work for them and because they don't have the legal ability, at least yet, or the balls, let's say, to do it instead. Because from what my reading of the Twitter files, that's essentially what happened, where you had the FBI, where you had officials within the Biden White House pressuring Twitter and big tech corporations to censor medical doctors, to censor conservatives, people that they didn't like. It's very difficult to read what's been exposed other than that. And I don't, for the record, I don't care if it's conservatives doing it. I don't care if it's liberals doing it. To me, it's the principle that matters. So what do you think about that issue, and what do you think about that specific thing of government using their coercive abilities to push big tech corporations? I know it's a box, so it's a big box, but any thoughts there?
Of course. I think the first thing, so the way in which governments operate when it comes to the spread of information is more active today, I think, than it has been in recent memory. There is a real push against misinformation and what most would consider a good thing, which is disinformation, right? People, creating fake videos of, Tom Cruise or whatever saying things. Yeah, like I agree. Like that stuff is bad and can be very terrible. But misinformation is where I'm concerned. Governments are taking a more active role in misinformation. So what is misinformation? A lot of what government shared during the COVID-19 pandemic came out to be untrue. Here in Toronto, Ontario, our provincial government didn't have enough PPE, so we were in lockdowns regularly. And the messaging from the government was it were the anti-vaxxers and it was the people having house parties spreading the vaccine. That's why we're shutting things down for the 5th time in the middle of winter. And, it's already minus 30 outside, so stay home. It's like, that's the worst thing you could do for mental health. But to answer your question, it does not surprise me that governments are using big tech or big corporations to push that messaging. Think about it, Nate. Like, we're social media digital natives in many ways. We routinely use social media for a lot more than just entertainment, and we use it as a news source. So I always wonder, how is it that I'm discovering things on my YouTube and Insta Reels I wouldn't normally discover? Sure, there's an algorithm behind that, but I could also, if I go down the rabbit hole, I could also see, the government playing around with that and censoring things that, I may have questions about. Here in Ontario, we had the Freedom Convoy movement, and I can't tell you how many Instagram posts were just flagged for inappropriate content. It's like there's no way the algorithm would have known that was inappropriate. So then, but the government didn't want people to gravitate to the movement as well. So I can see it. It makes sense to me. My concern is, what power do citizens have to call government out on it when the information can be so compartmentalized? They know what they're doing, and I feel like we're literally just the end user of it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, man. Quick question: is the Freedom Convoy the same as the Canadian trucker thing? Like, is that the same concept? Yeah. So I just want to make sure I was on the same page there. So,
of course, yeah.
Another layer to this, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe this is true. Is I believe, at the behest of the Canadian government, bank accounts were actually frozen for people within that movement. And that, to me, was, frankly, it shocked me. I didn't think that was something that a Western government like Canada would dare to do. And that was when one of the many moments where I said, okay, things are shifting here, and we need to talk about them, and we need to discuss them. And, back to the beginning of the podcast, why start a podcast? Why have these conversations? Yeah. Well, because I think these issues need to be discussed. And that was in my opinion, one of those pivotal moments. So what do you think about that?
Yeah, I wrote the Prime Minister a letter about when the Emergencies Act was enacted here in Canada as a result of the Freedom Convoy. Now, I need to be clear that the Freedom Convoy entered into a phase where there were blockades at borders, and there were protests at borders, and that had major national security implications, free flow of goods, economic impact. Here in Ontario, the Windsor border was blocked, and I believe one in Alberta as well. So I think the government felt like the local police were unequipped to deal with it with the current powers. And so they thought, okay, let's bring in the Emergencies Act, which gives the government sweeping authority, basically to prevent any type of public protest and to lock people up as a result and to seize private property as well. That to me violated every single charter right that we have as individuals. And I wrote the Prime Minister and I highlighted in the Charter of Rights and Freedoms what charter rights it violated. What's interesting is it was enacted after the blockades were coming down, and then it was voted. Most of the House of Commons voted in favor of it because the Liberals hold a minority, but there's another left-wing party called the New Democratic Party, and they usually vote to support the Liberal Party on their motions. So the Emergencies Act was supported by the NDP and the Liberals. It passed the House of Commons, and the government enacted it after the blockades were being taken down. And then I believe 24 hours later, Trudeau just said, we're not going to do the Emergencies Act anymore. So it was in effect for a day or maybe more than a day. Mm. But what's fascinating to me is that how swiftly the government moved to the most extreme act. And in a heartbeat, it turned Canada, again, in my opinion, from this free country into exactly what Orwell mentioned in 1984. It's like, there is the thought police, and it is very real. Like, I can't tell you, when those bank accounts were frozen, it was because someone found the donor list, posted it on Reddit, and government just matched up the names. And one of them was a director of comms in the government of Ontario, and they were fired from their job because they donated $100 to the Freedom Convoy. Like,
crazy.
I couldn't believe what was happening. And I'm like, how I don't care if you're left or right. This is not right. This is not right that our government is doing this. And I think the backlash was so severe, even within the Liberal Party, that Trudeau thankfully, withdrew after 24 hours. But to me, it was just like, it was this like moment where I realized what some say, which is the government kind of tries things and then they walk back. They try things, they see what's palpable, and then they walk it back. And this was a case where I thought the government really tried, and a lot of people in Canada, Nate, still believe they were within their rights to do it.
Yeah.
That's the scary part to me. It's like this democracy kind of phase, as I'd like to say, in human history, maybe it was tried before by an ancient civilization, and it failed because they saw the writing on the wall. Maybe we're trying it again, and we're running into the same issues. Because personally, I don't know what democracy holds for a human civilization in 100 to 200 years from now. Mm-hmm. Maybe this is just an experiment that may go awry when government's pushed to the limit.
Yeah. No, quite the... the Orwell box is very deep.
Yes.
So
yes,
that one is. It's perhaps the comparisons to 1984 are overdone. However, I would say nowadays it's difficult to make that case because there are things. Yeah. I think Elon said this. Every conspiracy theory for the past 2 years basically came true, which isn't necessarily true, but the general sentiment was basically true, and that's crazy. To live in that period of time, there's a number of factors there too. But I want to shift gears here to another topic because I really want to hear your thoughts on this. And you pointed this out a little bit earlier with the conversation about misinformation, people creating videos that aren't true, essentially. They didn't actually happen. And the term here is deep fakes, which I'll quick define again. So essentially, this is audio or video generated content that is indistinguishable from real content, or at least close to being indistinguishable, that has someone say or do or act something out that they never actually did, and is generated by an AI. And a lot of the versions right now, you can still tell, okay, yep, that obviously that either their mannerisms are off or the auto's a little off, but it won't be long until you can't tell.
Yeah.
And I think that this is going to have broad implications for the criminal justice system, the idea of evidence, the idea of truth as such. We're already living in a time where so much of even the idea of an objective truth has been just pilloried constantly. We live in a subjectivism society that's focused on your internal reality, which has its pros and cons. Back to the deepfake thing, one positive consequence of this that I want to quick talk about, because we can talk about the negative for sure, but this positive thing is quite interesting. This checkmark verification, this idea of okay, you are who you say you are. I think that this concept, this idea of all right, this is verified content from a person that is real, that is saying that, that's going to become much more important. And the positive side of that is the people that have done everything in their power to remain consistent in, let's say, their integrity and their pursuit of truth. I think those people are going to stand out because people are going to be craving a consistent, honest message that isn't been tainted, that isn't an AI, all those kind of things. And that's where I think podcasts come in potentially. And I really see at least that part as a potential positive. What do you think about that? And then you can talk about, I'm curious to hear your thoughts on AI in general. It's a big topic. But yeah, what do you think about that?
I think you're totally right. I think at the end of the day, Nate, we gravitate to humans. For all their flaws, we still gravitate towards them. To me, it's amazing people call Joe Rogan out on, a podcast that he did, 5 years ago. And it's like, if you listen to Joe Rogan podcasts, you don't have to agree with his line of thinking, but you gravitate towards it because it's a human being going through the motions of building that, as we discussed earlier, that understanding piece. And I think that naturally gravitates people to it. We're compelled by story. It's how our minds operate. In fact, it's why, all the religious texts from all the denominations will be around thousands of years. As long as humans are on this earth, those religious texts will exist. Why? Because they speak to a deep moral inclination inside all of us, but it's told in story. It's not told in, this is it, this is what you must do, if not, this is what's going to... No, it's like, there's elements of that, but the story is what keeps people riveted. It's why in India there are scenes of the Bhagavad Gita carved into sides of temples, because maybe some people thought that they would burn all the books with the Bhagavad Gita, and so in order to preserve that incredible story, they needed to carve those scenes to make sure they were never lost for the next generation. Into stone. In stone, you just can't, fire can't touch that or anything. So story is how we understand each other. I will say when it comes to deep fakes, it's very scary how lifelike these are getting and how real they're getting. It still is incredibly difficult to make them. I mean, I know you see the pictures of the Pope playing basketball and things like that, and that's kind of neat, but to make like a Joe Biden video of him saying, Donald Trump is a great man and we should all vote for him in 2024, that is an incredibly challenging and difficult video to pull off exceptionally well, with the pixels lining up perfectly in the mouth and the facial expressions. It has to be done. It can be done. The computers that are used behind that are like supercomputers. So I think that the reason why they exist in so few numbers so far is because of the computing power that's required for them. I think it's going to be more difficult for the Facebook and the social media giants to identify deep fakes, because the way we see it is, check out this deep fake of Steve Jobs and Joe Rogan's podcast. It's like, without that headline, you just watch it, you think, did they actually record something while Steve Jobs was alive? So it's going to be much harder for social media giants to notice it, but I wouldn't worry about it because it's not as easy as some might think. It's exceptionally difficult, and I think government regulation is going to come in soon enough, and it's going to really make it even more difficult to get that media out there.
Okay. Yeah. Hey, I do agree that it is fairly difficult. Here's another line of questioning I have.
Yeah.
What if, so let's say, this is what I'm concerned about. Let's say that within, a very short period of time, a deepfake is identified as, in fact, fake. My concern is that the damage of something like a deepfake of Biden, declaring war, let's say, on Iran or Russia or China or something like that. Something, that has very large-scale geopolitical consequences. Something like that that's put out there, even if the fact checkers, the deep fake checkers, whatever you say, get to it quickly, there's a potential for that kind of damage to have already been done, and I guess that's part of my concern. And even one of the consequences of this is I'm worried that people we're already in a time where we don't respect institutions, and we already have lost faith in a lot of them.
Yeah.
Some I think for good reason, some I think not.
Sure.
What does that do? That the consequences of something like that, even in a short period of time, can be cataclysmic. I don't know how we're going to address that. Any thoughts there?
Yeah, Nate. So I sense I'm older than you by a fair bit, and I do remember a little bit of when the internet first came out, and I remember very similar concerns about the free flowing of information, and is this going to create echo chambers? Is this going to create an undermining of government? And to be fair, I think we have actually seen that excuse me, on some degree. Like, we have seen incels and other extremist groups have a bigger platform than they wouldn't have without the internet. So that threat does exist. Sure. For sure. I think when it comes to like Biden creating a deepfake video of Biden launching a war on Iran, the reality is that the tension between the United States and Iran, as an example in this case,
sure,
is so strong that a deepfake video probably wouldn't do as much damage to that relationship as we might think. And I know that sounds like a bold statement to say, but because the tension is so palpable, it's like, yeah, I think a lot of people could actually see that. But Iran knows that the United States wouldn't do that outright without threatening, whatever percentage of oil comes through the Strait of Hormuz. And that's a major, major geopolitical risk and move. And I think we underestimate the sober second thought of a lot of people around our leaders sometimes that can say, like, okay, they're full of shit. That wouldn't happen in that scenario. So sometimes we undermine the rationalism that does exist in some of the most highest levels of decision making. And I think that where I see deepfakes having a major issue is with those that are emotionally unwell and a video putting them over the top. Something like aliens are coming to invade us kind of thing. Well, if you're already emotionally unwell, maybe you're going out and buying a bunch of guns. Maybe you're emptying your life savings at the grocery store. Maybe you're doing a lot of things. Maybe you're taking your life because
Sure.
What's the point? We're going to get invaded. So that's where I think deepfakes may have the biggest impact. It's on those that may be very emotionally unwell.
Yeah, no, that's it. That's a good point there. So we're about out of time here. So I want you to, if there's anything, final comments, like anything else that you want to quick touch on. Otherwise, let the audience know like where they can find you, and we'll go from there. So any final thoughts?
Yeah, I would just say that I rigorously defend the public square as much as possible. That understanding is so important to me, because we have to build public policy that's truly reflective of more voices and more people and what they want to see in their governments and what they want to see happen. And I think one thing that we have to be so concerned about is the fewer voices making bigger decisions. To me, the internet and podcasting is so powerful, but the next phase for me, one thing that I want to aspire to is moving podcast into, let's think about what are the tangible things we would want our governments to consider in public policy decisions. And let's make this more than just conversation, but more not advocacy, but governments make this part of the public discourse, make this part of the public square. Let's have an open discussion on abortion or capital punishment or climate change. Let's invite voices we don't agree with and sit down and talk and learn and absorb. The more exposure, the better. So podcasting to me is just one avenue, and there's so many more that I'd love to explore with it. Where people can find me? Yes, that's a great question. www.openmindspodcast.com. It's my baby. I love it. I started it last year, and it's got most of my episodes recently. Trying to upload more. But Instagram is probably the best place to find me. I post almost daily there. It's at openmindspod. And then on YouTube, same handle. And I'm trying to get back on Twitter because I feel like I've got so many ideas, and Twitter is a great kind of avenue for that. And I really do try to respond to all of the comments because I think it's so important that we have like a really good community of people who want this type of conversation to keep happening.
Cool. Hey man, really appreciate you coming on. I thought it was a great conversation.
Yeah.
A lot of cool overlap there. So I had a lot of fun, and thank you so much.
I love what you're doing, Nate. This is great, and I'm happy to be back.
For sure. All right. See you.
Thanks.